What I'm going to talk about today is architecture and gender, and in particular, female monastic architecture in Baroque Italy. If we think about paintings and sculpture, how they might affect and influence gender. For example, here we've got an early 16th century Italian painting by Titian of a woman looking very alluring and beautiful, clearly towards the patron and towards the viewer. And below you'll see a wonderful painting by Suzanne Valadon made in the 1920s, which is a woman sort of talking back, as it were, and saying not so. But I think when you think about architecture, it's less obvious how gender plays its part. So what I get in relation to convent architecture, nunneries really, of the 17th century. And I'm going to start with a sort of autobiographical narrative to tell you how I came to be interested to discuss some of what seems to me incredibly exciting architecturally about Baroque convents in Naples. And I'm starting with the personal because it's research that we do at universities is simply following an ordained plan, that we have a clear idea of what we plan to do in research, and then we simply go ahead and fill in the blanks, as it were. Whereas in fact, researchers are unforeseen factors. Some things go really well, other things go really badly, and you have to rethink the project, as it were. And research is an ongoing, never-ending process. Who collect things or obsessed by certain things. You are actually, even now, doing research. Well, the story starts, oh yes, and I've slightly changed the title. I'm calling it Shutting. So the story starts one day when I walked into the Courtauld Institute of Art in London, where I was doing my MA degree in 1984, which probably seems to you like prehistoric. Whirling in the air around a table in the entrance hall were piles of old black and white photos. They were sort of falling off the table, and they were for sale for a penny each. Photos like this one. Well, I was completely fascinated. Poor student, so I couldn't afford as many as I would have liked, but I bought up, armfuls. It turned out that these photos belonged to Anthony Blunt. He had been director of the Courtauld Historian. He was keeper of the Queen's pictures, and he was also a spy. And the fact that he was a spy for the Russians had just been recently full of embarrassment, and they wanted to put as much distance between themselves and Anthony Blunt as they possibly could. And that's why they were selling off his photos, the photograph that they had no time or regard for him anymore. Well, I just was fascinated by these photos. They struck me as very beautiful. And it turned out that he'd made them for a only book in English on Sicilian Baroque architecture. And he'd written it in 3 weeks in hotel bedrooms. What struck me was a combination of things. The extraordinary beauty nature of a lot of the architecture, and then finally, the complete scholarly neglect of these astonishing architectures. So the only book was here, as you can see, it was a study, and there was nothing else, nothing at all on the shelves, nothing at all in the British Library, or any book catalogues. So to my surprise, I did very well in my MA, and in those days, when you got your degree result, you would like to do a PhD. So I literally had not thought about it at all. I hadn't expected to do well. So when they said, would you like to do a PhD? I looked rather startled and said yes. And then they said, well, what will you do? Oh, Sicilian Baroque architecture, partly because I was still very cross about the way the Courtauld was treating Anthony Blunt. But I was very, very lucky. In those days, my first plan was to study an architect called Angelo Italia. So I went down with maps, and my Italian wasn't very good. I just done some evening classes, dictionaries, maps, and that sort of thing. I looked at his architecture, and I caught, lifts with milk floats and local lorries all over the place. And I found that although I had thought I would be absolutely wowed, it wasn't as exciting as all this stuff. I found it paled into insignificance next to this astonishing marble adornment. And these coloured marbles, which all came from Sicily, covered these churches, as you can see, from top to toe, with all kinds of complex iconographies and extraordinary. And there was nothing at all written about this work. People sneered at it. They thought it was rather vulgar, too ornate, and especially Protestant people. And there was absolutely nothing written about this inlaid marble, apart from 2 little paragraphs in that book by Anthony Blunt. This inlaid marble was, because of course it's expensive, the materials are expensive and the workmanship is expensive. The Jesuits had a lot of it, like here, but above all, it was concentrated. And that really interested me. And I got to wondering about why that was. So I investigated the finances of female convents through the archives. Or in a convent, you had to pay a dowry, like a marriage dowry, but to the convent. And quite a lot of aristocratic nuns went to these convents, and they also brought other incomes to the convent. And although this money was meant to be spent on individual nuns' religious necessities, in practice, the convents grabbed all this money and spent it. The people who were making these decisions were the nuns themselves, the nuns and the abbesses and the prioresses and the deaconesses and so on. So these dowries and these annual incomes gave female convents really. So I wrote a book about inlaid marbles, which had a chapter or two on female convents. But the next step was to test out the theory elsewhere. Expected, rather naively, but I expected to find more or less what I'd found in Sicily, in Palermo. But I didn't. It just wasn't like that. While some convents were decorated very richly, that decoration wasn't restricted to inlaid marbles of the sort that I'd found in Sicily and that I'd expected to find. Instead, inlaid in their adornment. And I just couldn't see a red thread that held them all together. At that point, the scholarship on convents forked. There was a sort of bifurcation, interested in the life that women lived in convents and books that studied architecture of convents. The stuff that looked at the conventual life tended to focus on enter a convent and establish monastic foundations or to sponsor artworks, was explained in terms of what these books called the piety of women, and the incomes as a testament to or expression of individual nuns' piety. So convent architecture was interpreted in terms of representing something that already existed, that is, women's piety as being pious and exceptional. While male patrons that I was reading about in relation to male churches, monasteries, they, in the scholarship, were allowed to be ambitious and interesting and effective. I wonder if this is really the case, or whether this is a prism that the scholars are putting on it, whether the scholarship itself was not restricted neat little boxes of piety and exceptionality. I also didn't like the way that the scholarship treated architecture as if it just followed after something else, as if it just things that supposedly already existed, because I thought that architecture actually did something more interesting than simply representing something already in existence. So I never really believed men were deemed to be more complex and interesting. The other branch of scholarship which was around in those days was this sort of thing, studies of scandal, particularly sexual scandal and scandalous nuns. And of course it was absolutely fascinating and it made very interesting reading. But the way these scholars approached it all was rather as if the nuns lived in outer convents at all. I was interested then in what happened in convents and how that related to the architecture. And I wasn't convinced by this story that it was all about piety, life and architecture and gender. And there was also an emergent scholarship on architecture and gender at that stage. But it was very much focused on 20th century. It was focused on 20th century issues, particularly domestic matters like kitchen design, the representation of women in architecture, how many of those clever people here, women especially, who should think about becoming architects. But all of this stuff about gender and architecture, it was really focused on contemporary stuff, while I was in of the 16th and 17th centuries. So I read all this scholarship and I thought about it, and I thought about how it might be useful, some aspects of it might be useful. But I went back to the Council of Trent of 1563, this very important meeting in the Catholic Church history. The Catholic Church met to discuss issues of reform. The Catholic Church was very worried because of the emergent Protestant Church, and it had a series of meetings about doctrine and liturgy and so on. Just before everyone went home at Christmas, it discussed female convents and nuns. And at that meeting, they issued lots of decrees, as these things always do, enclosure. And they said, the enclosure of nuns must be carefully restored wheresoever it has not been violated, and it be preserved wheresoever it has not, may leave the convent. So what it's saying there is that nuns were to be enclosed in convents, and henceforth they were not allowed out. This is 1563. Now this is point, because up until 1563, many convents had actually been what were called open convents, where women had lived communally, but had been engaged outside the convent, working in hospitals, to live in enclosed convents and not allowed out. No more teaching, no more medicine, just being shut in. And another part of the decrees said this: and for as much as those convents of nuns, which is often without any protection to the robberies and other crimes of wicked men, the bishops and other superiors shall, if they think it expedient, make it their care that old convents within cities. What that means is nuns living in convents in the countryside had to go into the cities. And look at this bit too, where it says, calling in, if need be, the aid of the, and if necessary, if the nuns didn't want to go, the bishops were to call in the secular arm, that is the army. So soldiers were going to come, round up the women and force them into the sort of bureaucratic language. And I want to draw your attention to this. It's all done as if it's in the interests of the women. You know, they're being protected from robberies and other crimes of wicked men. These poor little is to be safe. And but if they don't go, they're going to be forced to go by soldiers. So the decrees are worded as if the care and concern is in, but pushed into the cities against their will with the threat of force. Now, given that before the Council of Trent, many nuns had led very autonomous lives full of as nurses and that sort of thing, and others had lived in convents in the countryside, and now they were having to be forced into the cities, and others had lived in really great splendor, communally, servants in convents, and now they were going to have to be live in separate cells. Would you expect after 1563 that the number of nuns would go up? Well, I would have expected that the number of nuns would have gone down, because who wants to be bossed around by soldiers and locked up, basically? That the opposite was the case. The number of convents in Naples went up after 1563, and the number of nuns within each convent across all the orders increased very. That made no sense at all. And the effect on the city of Naples was very clear also from studying the maps. So here's a map of 66 here on the left, and you can see that at that point there are still orchards and open gardens in the city. But by about 1650, almost every square, convents and monasteries, whole blocks, streets, entire neighborhoods had become monastic complexes. Above all, female convents. The numbers just kept going up. And some people got very upset about this. You know, if this goes on, before long, the regulars will own the entire city. And this painting by Didier Barra of the mid-17th century, choirs and convents and monasteries. The density of monastic institutions in Naples surpassed even Rome, seat of the Catholic Church in the 17th century. Need of explanation. And here I've got to tell you a bit of history. In the 17th century, Naples was ruled by the Spanish crown. So the pale green is about there, Naples is about there, Sicily is down here. The pale green bits are all ruled by Spain, the Spanish king, who also, as you know, also was ruling the New World, the so-called New World in the Americas at this colonial empire. Now, that's relevant because the king of Spain, created an important court, grand palace, and a very significant court, and encouraged a new sort of emergent aristocracy to serve. The new aristocracy was made up of people who did well at the Spanish court in Naples, bureaucrats and lawyers who were newly ennobled by the Spanish king as in gratitude for their service to Spain to keep them loyal. And the old aristocracy, and what they did was they reinvigorated their feudal system. So above all, they made sure that their eldest son would inherit everything so that they wouldn't have to split up their property. If you're a landed aristocrat, what you want to do above all is ensure that the lineage continues. And you want to ensure your family will continue, and you want to hold on to your lands to continue to be written. You don't want to give them each a little bit of the land, because that will just reduce you soon to being not very powerful at all. So what they did was keep primogeniture, and the daughters weren't allowed to get married. The daughters were seen as a bit of a liability on the whole. They might marry off one daughter, but the others, They didn't want to have to give them dowries, beginning to ask for bigger and bigger dowries for when they married, when someone married into their families. And so the old aristocracy put, as it were, into convents. Why did they do that? Well, because convents were respectable places. They would be kept safe, they would be kept good, and virginity mattered in aristocratic honour. So they were like sort of, if you like, you know, a good safe place to store these daughters. Aristocratic families could bring them out and get them on the marriage market, but otherwise they'd just be there and they wouldn't be a huge drain on family finances. The aristocracy paid before, but those convent dowries, although they were big, they were nowhere near as big as marriage dowries, especially the sort of marriage dowries that the new Spanish aristocracy and the new bureaucratic aristocracy, all of that meant that there was an enormous growth in female monasteries from the very well-heeled groups. Lots of money, lots of posh daughters went in to pay off the old aristocracy against the new aristocracy. And they could charge higher and higher dowries and demand more and more vitalizi and that sort of thing. So convent dowries also expensive as real marriage dowries. So what were the effects of all this on enclosure and what happened architecturally? Were the architectural changes really prompted by piety, really prompted simply by obedient, looking more properly at the architecture? And I'm showing you here a sort of aerial view of Naples. And what will strike your mind immediately is this enormous convent complex here, like a battleship. And you will see too that the convent is sharply differentiated architecturally from what surrounds it. And here's another one here, here's another one here, here's another one here. So one of the many paradoxes of convent life is that as self-aggrandizing urban monsters, really. And the city became a city of dark, blind walls, these sort of convent walls here with windows very high up. The architecture held outsiders point locks and raised unassailable walls, producing mute blind alleys below. Architecturally, we see a rhetoric of fortification with rusticated, this sort of rough-hewn look, that's called rustication, and rusticated portals, barred windows. And convents fought to prevent their enclosure being shattered by being overlooked by people looking into them. And they did that by buying up blocks of land. Here's something which was sued by various convents. And this particular convent is buying up all of this property here. And it says it must own all of these little houses and all of these ordinary people living close by because they might peep through and they might see nuns. And it was terribly important that enclosure should be honoured. So in the name of the Council of Trent, in the name of enclosure, these buy up the property of ordinary people and expand. Architecture held outsiders at bay as the convents swallowed up the blocks. And what they do is they pay particular attention architecturally to points of anxiety. Points of anxiety are points to have contact with a lay person, so someone who's not a nun, an outsider from the city. So, for example, they created turn windows here to allow good to turn so that nobody saw anybody else. You wouldn't even see a hand of a nun if you brought the vegetables. So the virginal body was protected through its separation, potential violators, both sexual and social. Convents took to court anyone who violated their enclosure by building too close or too high, by subjecting them to what they called being placed at a disadvantage. And convents defended their privileges, air, space, and freedom in terms of the Council of Trent, in terms of enclosure, in terms of meek obedience and piety. Piety, what did they do architecturally? Well, they built magnificently. They went up, huge vertical buildings, gigantic. I mean, you can see here, there's this extraordinary belvedere, sort of place to take. There isn't anything terribly modest or unassuming actually about any of this. Aristocratic nuns felt entitled to see out and over, including out to sea, to avoid prejudices. And here you can see they have their own cells, they have their own little terraces. They lived actually very grandly indeed. It is not totally enclosed in a separate world, far from it. Indeed, they were even officially allowed to receive visitors from close family members in parlours. In parlours, they could meet with family members, ensured decorous proximity. What's interesting, I think, is the way in which separation and enclosure happened, but it's also performed architecturally. So bridge, so that the nuns could cross from one part to another without having to set foot in the street where ordinary people were. But very often as bridge, and then you could be following the Council of Trent decrees. But that's not what they get up to. They get up to things like this. So they are drawing attention to their separation. They're sort of performing enclosure as much as they're actually doing it. And they're performing it architecturally. And they lived extremely well. Here's a rather wonderful garden. They had servants. They ate well. They had all kinds of what they ate, what they dressed in. It wasn't a bad life at all within these confines. But it was a life which was very starkly enclosed in terms of grills, the ornate communion window, where the mass was passed to the nuns and where confession was said. Here's the window. Again, you could have had just a little modest window. Here it's gilded and made rather elaborate, kept separate from the priest. The architecture is making a great song and dance, that is what is happening. And here's one of these little windows that the nuns were able to receive the communion through. Slice through a church, and here's the facade. Here are the steps to go up. So you go up here through the front door, and then you're in the nave. And at this end here is the main altar. Here, up here, and ordinary folk, they worshipped down here. So the interesting enough to share the same churches for services. Can you hear? So, nuns were elevated at the clerestory level. Nuns are elevated up here. Ordinary folk are down below. And nuns were kept separate, a clerestory corridor. So the nuns could circulate in the convent without ever going down below. And they could look down through these little windows or jalousies to watch the service happening in the church below. And here we are looking down through the grills of one of those windows down into the church below where the mass would have been performed at that altar. Paradoxically then, punctuation of those walls by the grills of those windows through which the nuns looked, here they all are, which betrayed the presence of the nuns in their clerestory lofts. A member of the congregation could only get a better view of the nuns through its gaps, an advertency that couldn't be hidden from the others. So at Santa Chiara here, there are spikes on the grills, which make such prying dangerous. Everywhere then, the possibility of proxy is hinted at, suggested and implied beneath and behind the veil of architecture. And those grills and jalousies clothed the wall and the nun in marvellous metallic veils, or a veil. And these windows in the convent are a bit like these veils, made of metal, woven like cloth. They trouble any easy distinction between wall and decoration. They were highly decorated. This is not an architecture of modest enclosure, but a fabulously advertised distinction. Here are the nuns' choirs billowing forward suggestively. What is celebrated is the screen. What is nowhere is the paradox of enclosure sharper than in the nuns' choirs. Access to the choir was a privilege, only opened to professed nuns, and it could be taken from them. Here's another, and here's another. The nuns' choirs gave names to the choir nuns, who were the most important nuns in the convents. They were the nuns who were allowed into this choir. Lay sisters, who were not allowed into the choir, convents serving the choir nuns. Now, the nuns' choirs were usually at the west end, up here. So the nuns were behind these grates, looking towards the altar at the east end, as the lay folk in the service down below. Here is a whole series of West End choirs. In the 17th century, they get more and more elaborate, more and more of them happen in the 17th century in Naples, which is the East End choir. Here we are peeping into the church of San Gregorio Armeno from the entrance door, looking towards the altar there. If we imagine we're going in, here's the altar, here's the altar. And this is above the main altar. This is where the nuns would have been. And that's a really extraordinary thing to do, because it means the nuns are now looking directly at the congregation. They could actually even look. So meant that when the Mass happened, when the priest raises the Mass, which in those days was done, the priest remained facing the altar, and then he would raise it up above his head. It meant he would do that up here. So this building of East End choirs gave nuns a spectacular sort of privileged relationship with God. And here at Santa Maria del Gesù, the East End is particularly extraordinary. You can see that the nuns' choir is located behind this pediment, and there's a Gloria dramatically top lit from the lantern of swarming cherubim. The nuns peeked out from these openings here, and they become like part of the heavenly choir, part of a glimpse into paradise itself. And you can imagine them part of heaven. So what I'm drawing your attention to here is that architecture is doing something that you never would have been allowed to say, that nuns should have a privileged relationship with the Mass. You would never be allowed to say that the priest should raise the Eucharist towards the nuns and look up at them at the moment of when the wine miraculously becomes the blood of Christ and the host, the body. You would never have been allowed to say any of that. But architecture, these women, incredibly important, not only to themselves, but as it were to God within this sort of staging. So these machines in which nuns are, yes, they're enclosed, and they can be seen to be very pious, but a lot more is also going on behind the scenes. In the name of their protection, of the rights they had enjoyed, but the nuns pushed back and arguably enjoyed greater autonomy and more independence and creative freedom inside their convents than they commissioned the architecture and art. They commissioned everything you can see in this photograph. They also composed music and operas. There are an enormous number of operas and music performed, plays, and they had their own gardens. So the life was not entirely impoverished. Here we are now up in one of those choirs, peeping through the grills. And here's another. So you can see the sort of view that the nuns might have had in the 17th century of the lay folk down below. And just one last point I want to make, that in those spaces around the choirs, but also the corridors like this one, in those spaces, what nuns did was import lots of little altars, like we can see here, lots of altars. And this is somewhere where even priests weren't allowed to go. So these enclosed spaces created in order to honour the Council of Trent, in order to follow the rules, were the ones where they introduced their greatest autonomy, their greatest independence, and their greatest creative freedoms. So what I hope you'll have seen is that convent architecture is rich and generative, it's complex, and it's productive, and it's paradoxical. On the one hand, it sort of tugs the fallout and wanted people to do. On the other hand, you can see that the nuns are pushing back and doing all kinds of extraordinary things behind the scenes. And that architecture produces different sorts. These women didn't enter convents because they were pious, or only because they were pious, but because it suited their families for them to do so. And yet, behind the scenes, they push back. And the architecture is self-effacing, but it's ambitious and glorious. And that's the end.